Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, March 26th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. UK court to decide on Tuesday on the Assange appeal. So London's High Court will rule on Tuesday whether WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange can appeal his extradition to the United States, where he would face trial for exposing U.S. war crimes. So according to WikiLeaks, the written ruling is due to be delivered by 10:30 a.m. London time. So that's only about 6 hours after this show is posted. So by the time many of you are listening or watching this, the ruling might have already been handed out. So last month, Assange's legal team presented its case for the appeal. And so again, this is the decision on whether or not they can do, a formal appeal. And as far as I understand, if this gets rejected, Assange doesn't really have any other legal steps left to fight the extradition. I think there's just one European human rights court they could try to go through, but not sure how binding that would even be in the UK. It's tough to know what they're going to decide. It's hard to be optimistic when it comes to this case, considering everything that's happened, but let's hope that they rule that he can appeal it. On the other hand, the appeal will probably be, if there is an appeal, it'll probably be a very long, drawn-out process, and Assange would remain in Belmarsh prison, where he's in really poor health. The 2-day appeal that they did last month, he didn't even attend it because his health is so bad. His wife, his legal team, his brother, they all say he's in really bad shape, and they think he'll die if he gets extradited to the U.S. So one thing I mentioned in this story, because I think it's just really important kind of to always bring this up. So during the appeal hearing last month, Assange's legal team did present some new evidence, including a report from Yahoo News that revealed that the CIA in 2017 considered assassinating Julian Assange, according to this report. And they plotted to kidnap him from the Ecuadorian embassy in London over WikiLeaks publishing Vault 7, which revealed CIA hacking tools. And Mike Pompeo was the head of the CIA at the time and was totally furious about it. I think that should be enough to drop the case altogether. So again, we'll see what happens. And this comes after that report that said the U.S. is considering a plea deal for Assange. So we'll see if anything comes out of that. I'm sure both sides are not really discussing it too seriously or considering it too seriously until this decision is made. So what we can do, WikiLeaks has been asking Americans to put pressure on the U.S. by contacting their House representatives and telling them to support HRES 934, which is a bill introduced by Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona. And this bill calls on the U.S., calls on Biden to drop the charges against Assange. So that's what we could do for our part. Just try to make some noise about this because this is such an important case. This is over the WikiLeaks publishing the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs and State Department cables that Assange received from Chelsea Manning, and that was, his source. He was doing journalism. They're trying to criminalize journalism, and this could set such a dangerous precedent in the United States and around the world, considering Assange is not an American. He's an Australian citizen, and the U.S. is trying to pluck him out of the U.K. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. claims that Israel is following international law. So this is just a complete joke. So the State Department claimed on Monday that Israel is using U.S. weapons without violating international or U.S. law, despite the massive civilian casualties in Gaza and the starvation blockade that's been imposed on the Strip. So under this new national security memorandum that was issued, and I covered this a little bit, One reason I didn't put too much attention on it was because I figured it was nonsense and that they would do something like this. But anyway, under this new memorandum, the U.S. requires countries armed with U.S. weapons to provide assurances that they won't violate international law or block humanitarian assistance. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gave the assurances in a letter that he issued earlier this month. The State Department, on top of claiming that Israel is not violating the law, even though we see what's coming out of Gaza, we see what's happening there, they're also claiming that Israel is not violating international law by imposing restrictions on aid entering Gaza. I mean, how can they say that they're not restricting aid or they're not blocking aid to a point where it violates the law when the U.S. is doing these airdrops and supposedly building this pier to get more aid in? I mean, it's just a complete joke. And you have even Blinken acknowledge that 100% of Gaza's population is facing severe levels of acute food insecurity due to the Israeli siege. But anyway, so the State Department, this is State Department spokesman Matt Miller. He said, quote, "We've had ongoing assessments of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law. We have not found them to be in violation, either when it comes to the conduct of the war or the provision of humanitarian assistance. We view those assurances through that ongoing work we have done," end quote. And now the State Department has until May 8th to submit a report to Congress on Israel's compliance with international law. So by backing, what this is doing here, by backing these Israeli assurances, the Biden administration can continue to arm Israel to support this slaughter in Gaza, which has killed over 32,000 Palestinians, including over 13,000 children. The certification from the U.S. came after a video was released of an Israeli drone killing 4 unarmed Palestinian men in a series of strikes. And that was the video I covered yesterday. The last man that was killed, and they looked like young men, the last one that was killed was trying to crawl away. At first he was limping away, and then he fell down, and he was trying to crawl away from the area. Boom, and they hit him again and killed him. So I just think it's really something very symbolic of the whole thing that's happening here, that video comes out the weekend before the U.S. certifies this and backs this claim that Israel's not violating the law by killing all these children, by destroying all the civilian infrastructure and imposing this blockade. And dozens of congressional Democrats have urged Biden to suspend military assistance to Israel by invoking foreign assistance laws that prohibit aid to countries that block humanitarian assistance. But so far, the pressure has not worked. So on Sunday, Kamala Harris, the vice president, said that she would not rule out consequences for Israel if it launches a ground assault on Rafah. And it's strange that this is coming from Kamala Harris because you haven't seen Biden or Blinken or Sullivan say this. So this seems to be kind of coordinated, PR to make it look like the administration, at least some part of the administration, is threatening consequences for Israel if they invade Rafah. It's hard to believe, especially when you see this this whole thing with them certifying this thing and that funding bill that Biden signed into law over the weekend gave Israel their annual military aid. It's hard to believe that they are considering consequences, but hopefully some of this pressure from Democrats does something. All right, so the next one here, the UN Security Council passes Gaza Ceasefire resolution, and the U.S. abstains. So the UN Security Council on Monday adopted a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza for Ramadan, which is only a few weeks left of Ramadan, and it also called for the release of all hostages. So the U.S. abstained from the vote, and the other 14 members of the Security Council voted in favor of the resolution. The U.S. had previously vetoed 3 resolutions calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. On Friday, China and Russia vetoed a U.S.-authored resolution that said it was imperative for a ceasefire in Gaza but only in connection with the release of the hostages. So the U.S. one explicitly said only a ceasefire with the release of hostages. This one didn't explicitly say that. It just called for both things to happen. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said that the U.S. did not vote in favor of the resolution passed on Monday because it did not agree with the language. She said, quote, "We did not agree with everything with the resolution. Certain key edits were ignored, including our request to add a condemnation of Hamas," end quote. And she also hinted that the U.S. opposition was due to the fact that the ceasefire was not explicitly tied to a hostage release. So the U.S. did not vote in favor of it, but also they didn't veto it. So I know that this might not seem like much, but it is a change a little bit here that the U.S. let this pass. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, he insisted that the U.S. decision did not amount to a change in policy, and he noted that the resolution, he said that the resolution is non-binding, so it won't impact Israel's military operations, basically saying it's just symbolic and meaningless, which, that UN resolutions really, they can't be enforced. But the fact that the U.S. is saying that, it just goes to show the hypocrisy, because this was a resolution just condemning Hamas and demanding they release the hostages. They wouldn't say something like that, like it's non-binding. And of course, Israel is very upset about this. And in response, Netanyahu canceled the Israeli delegation that was supposed to visit Washington to discuss the attack on Rafah. If you remember, he agreed to send that delegation. So that means that they might just go ahead with this thing anyway without any input from the U.S. And of course, there are all sorts of comments from Israel's ambassador to the UN and other Israeli officials. Unfortunately, this ceasefire resolution probably isn't going to do much, but hopefully it helps to add the pressure. Just keep building that pressure. All right, so the next one here, Israel's defense minister says that there is no moral right to end the slaughter in Gaza. So during a visit to Washington on Monday, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant responded to the UN Security Council, passing a resolution that called for a Ramadan ceasefire in Gaza, saying that Israel had no moral right to stop its brutal military operations. So he said, quote, "We have no moral right to stop the war in Gaza until we return all the hostages to their homes. If we don't reach a clear and absolute victory in Gaza, it could bring a war in the north closer," end quote. So while Gallant signaled that Israel could stop if all the hostages were released, that's not what Netanyahu's been saying. He's repeatedly said his goal is to eradicate Hamas, even though the U.S. and Israeli intelligence don't think that's a realistic goal. And Israel has also refused to engage with Hamas on their demand for a permanent ceasefire in exchange for the release of all the hostages, and they also want Palestinian prisoners to be released as part of that deal, but they keep rejecting Hamas's offers that are for a permanent, lasting ceasefire. And again, that would include the release of all the Israeli hostages. So that's really just Gallant's response, and he said that he's in Washington to rally more support for Israel and for the Israeli military to help strengthen it. So he's going to be asking for new weapons and more aid and things like that while he's in the U.S. So this is a different delegation than the one that Netanyahu canceled that was to discuss the Rafah attack. All right, so the next one here, Trump says that Israel is losing a lot of support. So some interesting comments from the former president here. So Trump said in an interview with Israel Hayom over the weekend that Israel made a big mistake by broadcasting images and videos of the destruction in the Gaza Strip, saying that it's losing Israel a lot of support. Trump said in the interview that he was asked basically, what would you do if your family was killed on October 7th? He said that he would have done the same thing as Israel, like basically justifying this horrific war that's happening here. But he has also said that it's time for Israel to finish it, and because of the global opinion is turning against Israel. So Trump said, quote, "You got to get it done, and I am sure you will do that, and we got to get to peace because We can't have this going on. And I will say Israel has to be very careful because you're losing a lot of the world. You're losing a lot of support. You have to finish up. You have to get the job done, end quote. So when asked by the interviewer about how he would respond to the wave of anti-Semitism since October 7th, Trump said something pretty interesting. I'll just read his quote. He said, quote, "Well, that's because you fought back, and I think Israel made a very big mistake. I wanted to call Israel and say, don't do it. These photos and shots, I mean moving shots of bombs being dropped into buildings in Gaza. And I said, oh, that's a terrible portrait. It's a very bad picture for the world. The world is seeing this every night. I would watch buildings pour down on people," end quote. It was interesting because I've been saying that for a while, that people can see with their own eyes what's happening here. And it's not just because of what Israel's putting out publicly. It's also because of the Palestinian journalists on the ground in Gaza. But at the same time, Israel has put out all these videos, of demolitions and stuff. So the interviewer then claimed to Trump that terrorists were hiding in the buildings. And he replied, quote, "Well, that's because you fought back. And I think Israel made a very big mistake. I wanted to call Israel and say, don't do it. These photos and shots." I actually put the wrong quote in there. I have to fix that. But he basically said that if you are, when he was asked about the terrorist thing, he said, you got to do what you got to do, but you made a big mistake by showing it to the world. So Trump also took shots at Democrats for the growing criticism of Israel from within the party. He said, quote, this is also pretty interesting. This is the one thing that's nice about Trump is he sometimes just says things that they're not really supposed to say. Like this. He said, quote, "Some 15 years ago, Israel had the strongest lobby. If you were a politician, you couldn't say anything bad about Israel. That would be like the end of your political career. Today, it's almost the opposite. I've never seen you have AOC +3, these lunatics," end quote. He goes on there, so I'm just going to end it there. But he's saying it's a bad thing that these politicians are now able to speak out against Israel. And it's only a very small number that really do it sincerely. But he's saying it's a bad, like he's not happy about it. But it's just interesting that he said, 15 years ago it would end your political career. So Trump said that the Hamas attack on Israel wouldn't have happened if he was still president. That's something he has repeatedly claimed in any interview when he's asked about this. He called Biden, he says Hamas has no respect for them. He's a very dumb person that can barely talk. And I just mentioned at the end of this is one thing he always says is, oh, this would have never happened on my watch. But he was an extremely pro-Israel president. He gave Israel everything that they wanted, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli, these Abraham Accords, and all this stuff, and this so-called peace plan that Jared Kushner crafted, that essentially would have formalized the apartheid conditions in the West Bank. And this all played a role into the tensions. So this idea that he was brought peace to the Middle East is not true, because again, this all played a part. And that was the big thing. The Abraham Accords, that was Netanyahu's thing, was basically go around the Palestinians, open up with all the Arabs, and we don't actually have to settle this issue with the Palestinians. We could just keep doing what we're doing, slowly annexing the West Bank through settlements. That was a big part of Netanyahu's plan, which blew up in his face. But still, definitely some interesting quotes. I mean, you can't imagine Biden saying anything like that. If asked about anti-Semitism growing, basically saying, "Oh, it's because Israel's, destroying Gaza and the whole world can see it." All right, so the next one here: Israel gets 99% of its weapons from the U.S. and Germany. So amid growing calls for the U.S. to stop arming Israel, data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has shown that Israel gets 99% of its arms from the U.S. and Germany. So the SIPRI report said that from 2019 to 2023, the U.S. accounted for 69% and Germany for 30% of Israel's arms imports. The report said that the imported weapons, particularly combat aircraft received from the U.S., has played a major role in Israel's military actions against Hamas and Hezbollah. So this goes to show how reliant Israel is on these U.S. weapons. So if the U.S. does cut them off, and cutting them off could involve not providing spare parts for aircraft, that's a big thing, and maintenance. It could potentially ground the Israeli Air Force eventually if that happens. So, this report also mentions how at the end of 2023, the U.S. started rapidly delivering thousands of bombs and missiles to Israel, which was all those shipments that the U.S. has been sending over the past few months. All right, so the next one here, U.S. official accused Israeli army of sexually abusing Palestinians. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it says an Israeli general said that a U.S. official accused the army of systematically sexually abusing Palestinian women during a private meeting, and this was reported by Israeli media on Sunday. In an interview with 103 FM radio station, General Amir Avivi said he was shocked when the allegation was made by someone who he described as the holder of the Israeli-Palestinian portfolio at the U.S. State Department. He said, quote, "We sat there, talked about the situation, and suddenly she accused Israel of systematically sexually abusing Palestinian women," end quote. The U.S. official allegedly said in the meeting that the UN had presented evidence to the Israeli government, which Avivi denied, he said was disconnected from reality. And he said, quote, "Does it make sense that this phenomenon would exist and the media would never have reported on it?" End quote. So Middle East Eye points out that in February, which I think I covered, UN experts said that they received reports of Palestinian female detainees being subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault in Israeli detention since October 7th. At least 2 detainees were reportedly raped, while others were allegedly threatened with rape and sexual violence. The experts added that hundreds of Palestinian women and girls have been arbitrarily detained since the war started. So it's interesting that a State Department official said that to an Israeli general. All right, so the next one here, Israeli assassination attempt kills civilian in Lebanon. So this article is from Jason Ditz, and it says, on Sunday, an Israeli drone strike against a vehicle near Sawari killed the driver, and this is in Lebanon. Discussions among Lebanese security sources reveal they believe this was an assassination attempt against an unnamed Hamas official who was traveling on the same road. The discussion gave no indication of how close the Hamas official was to the drone attack, only commenting that he escaped. The driver who was killed, and this is something Jason covered, I think I went over yesterday. The driver who was killed was a Syrian civilian who was described as delivering groceries in a car belonging to a store owner. Though Israel has attacked the Bekaa Valley several times this year, the drone attack was the first time in this area. And so this failed assassination was reported in the Israeli press. Israel has not issued a statement on the drone attack since it was revealed that a civilian was killed. And this is they said in Baalbek. There was other strikes, which is like northeast Lebanon, pretty far from the border with Israel. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. Oh, wait, that's a story I left up from yesterday. The U.S. envoy claims that ISIS is still a threat in Iraq. So this article is from The Cradle, and it says ISIS still poses a threat in Iraq, and the U.S.-led military's work with Iraq to fully defeat the organization is not done. U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Alina Romanowski, claimed in an interview with Reuters published on March 25th. So this comes as Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has been asking the U.S. to leave Iraq, and the U.S. and Iraq are apparently in talks about the future of the U.S. military presence. And al-Sudani is actually going to travel to the U.S. soon. So now you see the U.S. ambassador claiming the justification for their continued presence is ISIS, and claiming that ISIS has not been defeated, even though al-Sudani and Iraq's military say that they can handle the ISIS remnants no problem, and that they want the U.S. to leave. And of course, the U.S. presence in Iraq is very destabilizing. There hasn't been attacks recently, but not too long ago, there was all these rocket and drone attacks on the U.S. bases and U.S. airstrikes and drone strikes in Iraq, killing members of actually the Shia militias who are actually part of Iraq's military. So the whole thing is a mess, and the U.S. should leave, but they're still claiming that ISIS is a problem. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. used $300 million to arm Ukraine while it had a $10 billion deficit. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. And so if you remember, earlier this month, the U.S. miraculously found $300 million to give to Ukraine. And they used that money to send them more cluster bombs and all sorts of other types of weapons. So there are these reports saying basically that money... They claim that they saved $300 million by cutting costs on other procurement contracts. I think it came specifically from the U.S. Army budget, or they claimed it did. But the Pentagon also said, and right before this, that they had a $10 billion deficit in funds needed to buy weapons to replace depleted U.S. depots. So this kind of raised a lot of questions, because on one hand they're saying they need $10 billion to replace weapons that they've already sent to Ukraine, and then they make $300 million appear to send more weapons to Ukraine. And it just goes to show, if they want to keep fueling this proxy war, they'll find the money somehow. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from John Walsh: cut off war funds by stopping the House discharge position. So this is important. The House House Democrats are trying to push through this discharge petition, which would force a vote on that $95 billion foreign military aid bill that includes money for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, just all of it. And they need, I think they need 218 signatures for a discharge position that would force a vote, that would bypass House Speaker Johnson and force a vote on it. And if it did come up for a vote, it probably would pass. So right now it has 191 signatures. So John here lists the 22 progressive Democrats who have not signed the discharge position, likely because they're due to their opposition for giving more aid to Israel. And he's saying you should, if any of them are your representative, you should encourage them, contact them, and encourage them to hold their position, to maintain their position. And of course, you could look at the list and contact your representatives, whether or not, they sign the discharge petition or not, and tell them that you are against them signing it and that they shouldn't bring this monstrosity to the floor for a vote. So go check that out. One from Matthew Ho: an escalatory game for fools and madmen. One from Norman Solomon: close-up of death culture. 1,000 in showbiz proclaim support for Gaza slaughter. One from Hekmat Abu Khater: inside the anti-Syria lobby's push for more starvation sanctions. This is from the Gray Zone, and it's a great article about Hekmat went undercover at this lobby event for people calling for more sanctions, more starvation sanctions on Syria, the anti-Syria lobby. Our spotlight is from John Hoffman: Israel is a strategic liability for the U.S. So please go check all that out. You could always support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Follow us on Instagram. A lot of great posts over there now. Follow us on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. That's it for me for today. Let's hope there's some good news in a few hours when it comes to Julian Assange. But I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.